Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really honored to be gathered with all of you on an eventful day in the world, and also, an eventful time in our collective history together, to be celebrating this book, The Four Pivots, Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves, by Dr. Shawn Ginwright. And we're joined by Dr. Ginwright and by Dr. Farima Pour-Khorshid. I'm going to introduce Dr. Pour-Khorshid first. She is a Bay Area educator, organizer, and scholar. After teaching at the elementary grade levels in her community for over a decade, she spent the latter half of her teaching career also supporting educators locally, nationally, and internationally through her roles as a university professor, teacher, supervisor, and educational consultant, as well as a community organizer. She is now a professor and teacher supervisor at the University of San Francisco in California. Much of her work is rooted in grassroots organizing with Teachers for Social Justice, the Abolitionist Teaching Network, which we were just talking in the green room. We've got many Atlanta folks tied in there, and that's a wonderful resource for folks who don't know, and the Education for Liberation Network, as well as her healing-centered facilitation and programming with Flourish Agenda. She is committed to centering abolitionist teaching, ethnic studies, and healing-centered engagement within and outside the field of education. As such, she is one of the editors, authors, and organizers that celebrated on the recently released book, Lessons in Liberation and Abolitionist Toolkit, which is another book that Charis loves and sells very well. So we're very honored to have you here. And the person of the hour of the evening or the afternoon, if you're watching in California, is Dr. Shawn Ginwright. He is one of the nation's leading innovators, provocateurs, and thought leaders on African-American youth activism, and youth development. He is a professor of education in the Africana Studies Department and a senior research associate at the San Francisco State University. His research examines the ways in which youth and urban communities navigate through the constraints of poverty and struggle to create equality and justice in their schools and communities. He is the founder and chief executive officer of Flourish Agenda, Inc., a national nonprofit consulting firm whose mission is to design strategies that unlock the power of healing and engage youth of color and adult allies in transforming their schools and communities. He is, of course, the author of the book, The Four Pivots, which we are celebrating tonight, and his other books include Hope and Healing in Urban Education, How Activists and Teachers Are Reclaiming Matters of the Heart, Black Youth Rising, Activism and Radical Healing in Urban America, Black in School, Afrocentric Reform, Black Youth and the Promise of Hip Hop Culture, and co-editor of Beyond Resistance, Youth Resistance and Community Change, New Democratic Possibilities for Practice and Policy for America's Youth. So we're delighted to have you both here. We're delighted to have all of you watching at home and to have our partner in this work, Auburn Avenue Research Library, with us in the chat. We encourage folks who are watching to shout out where you're watching from. We love to know kind of who's in the room. And we want to let you know that you can ask questions. So you can put them in the chat or you can put them in the Ask a Question tab, which is towards the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to work those in at some point. But thank you both so much for being here. It's truly an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in conversation today. Shawn, we've been talking about this
Farima.
Years, right? Over years. And so I just first want to say thank you for your courage to write this book. There was a lot of provocative things that you're pushing us on, and I want to get to it. Is that cool?
Yeah, I want to say thanks to Charis Books for hosting this, the work that you're doing in Atlanta, and just really making sure that folks are just staying fed. People's souls are fed. Doing this work is so important. So thanks to Charis Books for pulling this together.
Yes. So Shawn, let's talk about the book. This has been years in the making. I'm thinking about so many conversations we've had on your patio deck. I'm thinking about healing retreats that we've been part of where things come up. And when these things come up, you never shy away from saying, let's pause. Let's take a moment to really process what's happening in this moment, and make some pivots. So I want to first just start off with the word choice. You call this book, you specifically use the word pivot. Why did you use the word pivot and maybe not shift or other words that you could have used?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this, when the book title came out of the material of the book. I didn't start with the title, but I was trying to, think about a word that conveyed subtle change, maximum impact. And there's two ways that we can think about a pivot, a shift, a change in direction. Those terms require conscious, deliberate energy, thought, and movement, right? Where a pivot is much more subtle, that when you engage in that pivot, the direction of that pivot, you end up in an entirely different place. A pivot is also a leverage point. We have a lot of challenges that we're dealing with in our society. And if you think of like a seesaw, right? The pivot on the seesaw is the thing in the middle that allows you to take something heavier than yourself, and pull it up. It gives you leverage on tough problems. And it is not the same as problem solving. It's a way of being and a way of engaging with our problems and with each other that allow us to have different solutions. So I was intentional about the word pivot to really convey that there are things that we can do that seem minor, that seem subtle, but have profound transformative impact on our work.
Thank you for that. And with that, you described 4 particular pivots, and I'll name them, but I really would love to go one by one, and I want to lift up certain parts of the book and go deeper. So the 4 pivots, you talk about awareness, right? Moving from lens to mirror, and a shift from that external focus that limits our perception to one of honest self-reflection. That's the first one. The second one, you talk about connection, and it's pivoting from these transactional relationships to transformative relationships. Then you talk about the third pivot, which is vision, and it's rethinking what we think we know by shifting from this obsession with like problem loving to possibility creating. And then the last one, you talk about presence, right? Moving from hustle to flow. And it's this idea of divesting from the hustle mentality rooted in extractive capitalism to find a calmer, gentler, and more productive flow state. So we're going to go through each of these. And I want to start with the first one, thinking about lenses and mirrors. And I particularly love this one, especially right now. We're navigating a time where there is a lot of pain, a lot of I think about like Emily Borg's work around rupture and heartbreak and movement harm, right? And so in the book, you say when we don't turn inward to deal with our own stuff, we build up this false idea about power and ultimately build movements with wounded warriors. And our real power comes from the courage to deal with our fractured relationships, the vulnerability to acknowledge our hurt feelings, and the awareness to know when our ego shows up. And I had to underline star in the book. So you talk about the utility and the limitations of only doing lens work or only doing mirror work. So can you define both for us and tell us why we need both?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, Farima. We need both. But our default in change work, the default is our lens work, right? And I know I was trained to have a lens on how I see the world. I was trained to have theories to describe racism. I have theories to understand inequality in schools. I have frameworks to measure all of these things. And a lens is deeply important because it allows us to see and understand the issues that we need to confront and deal with. But sometimes I think we think the lens is the whole toolkit that we need for deep transformative change. And I think I realized that when I was trying to finish my doctorate degree, raising $500,000 for an organization, a community-based organization. I had a son that was colicky. I couldn't pay we had just, bought a house, and I was trying to make mortgage, and it's just so much happening in my life. And I was focusing on Lens when I actually had a sort of a breakdown. Like, I woke up one night crying. I was crying, I was sobbing, and then I got it together, and my wife came in and said, "What's wrong?" And she had never seen me in that state. And I had to sit with her question, what was wrong? And what was wrong was I was tired. What was wrong was as I felt defeated. What was wrong is I felt powerless. And it was that process of my own sort of, well, what am I doing there? Where am I going? Where's my life going? What brings me more meaning? What does sustainability mean in this work? I mean, the mirror work is the work of the deeper reflection that sometimes we don't even give ourselves permission to ask. And without asking it, we never examine our wounds. We just know we got them. Mm-hmm. And we bury them, and we kind of say, yeah, that hurt, but let me keep it moving. And I think that process of, it's easier to have an analysis. It's easier to put a pair of glasses on and look outward. That's easier work. Painful, but easy, because we can name the challenges and the problems and the analysis of why they occur. But the harder work is sitting with your own trauma. The harder work is dealing with your own wounds. Mm. And without doing that, my concern is that we over rely on our Lens work. And as a result of that, never have fully healed well movements, right? And the Lens work, Farima, that's scary as hell. Mm-hmm. It's messy. It makes you pissed off, because most of the time the Lens work, you're doing Lens work when somebody that you respect and is close to you tells you something that pisses you off about yourself, right? It pisses you off because something about that is true. Something about that you haven't dealt with, right? But the Lens work, I think, is sometimes not given the primacy, not given the importance of transformative movement building. Mm-hmm. And so this book, Mirror Work, suggests that we engage and lean into that with each other and give ourselves permission, damn it, mm-hmm. to go inward, that inward journey, and to not only examine our wounds, but ask questions about what brings us joy. We have the permission to do that. Mm-hmm. I kind of grew up in the movement, from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and then later on moved up to the Bay Area and was sort of, enculturated with sort of movement building in a particular way that didn't give me permission, to give me the space nor permission to ask questions about what brings me joy, about what brings my community beauty. And so I think that this mirror work tied to our Lens work gives us a much more complete terrain to engage in our work for justice and transformative change.
The more that I was reading that part of the book, the more that I thought about the responsibility we have in leadership when we have power, right? Because you talk about this idea of obstruction spots. And this is where the mirror work comes in, is for us to try to interrogate those obstruction parts. And you write in the book, you say leaders with the inability to reflect can work for racial justice and still practice patriarchy. Advocates for justice reform who lack reflection can reinforce white supremacy. And organizers without reflection can conflate call-out culture with accountability. So can you talk more about obstruction spots and why this matters for us right now in this moment too?
Yeah. Obstruction spots are things we just don't see. And we don't know that we can't see them. Mm-hmm. About 10 years ago, in one of my Africana Studies classes, I was teaching a course on Black urban America and its evolution and how it came about. And the first day of class, I'll never forget, we went through all the readings and I was talking about the class. I was so excited. And usually students they're like, yay, we're gonna have a great class, and I'm excited. But after class, or actually it was just during class, towards the end, this young sister raised her hand and she said, Dr. Ginwright, this class looks really dope. And I was like, yeah, it does, right? This is a good class. She said, yeah, all the readings look really good, except every single reading you have here are by men. Now, my lens work said yes, but these are the important theoretical constructs that we need to engage in this.
They are foundational.
And that this is, and I actually did that. And then she said, so women don't have anything to say about the exploration of Black community life? Mirror work. And so the mirror work to me said that was an important mirror she just put in front of my face. Right? It was a blind spot, but the obstruction spot is sometimes a gift. It's a gift that somebody says, look, this is something that you don't see, but by seeing it, you can grapple with it. You could address it. You could do with it, but without seeing it, it just stays there, right? And in terms of leadership, this is so critically important because without examining these obstruction spots, we inadvertently don't even know that they're there, and we carry them out in our leadership. We carry them out in our relationships. And that fosters the toxicity that sometimes we see in our organizations and we see in our movements.
So beautifully said. And honestly, just hearing you talk about it feels very healing. So thank you for expanding on that. In the second pivot, you talk about pivoting from these transactional relationships that we have in leadership, right? When we operate from our titles and from things that people can do, and pivoting towards transformative relationships, right? But specifically, like, you really go into this idea of vulnerability. And I remember us having a conversation about this because we're like, yeah, it's important for us to be vulnerable, right, in order to access those transformative relationships. But it's so important to really think about the nuances of vulnerability. And so in the book, you talk about the politics of vulnerability. And I love this section so much. And you make a distinction between structural vulnerability and emotional vulnerability. So can you talk a little bit more about these transformative relationships and why vulnerability matters in them?
Yeah, I mean, part of, we know that transactional relationships, kind of surface relationships that we engage with each other that are a result of our titles, they're important for efficiency, right? But we're talking about deep change, like if you went to a doctor and a doctor diagnosed you with something bad, or your parent with something bad, that's just transactional. You actually need someone there to hold, to talk to sit with you, right? And we've all experienced the power of transformative relationships. Everyone in here has gone through some stuff. You've been through a shitstorm. You've been through stuff, and hopefully your community, your family, your partner was there and was with you, right? And that can only come, like those transformative relationships can only come when we give ourselves permission, what I say, that we allow our humanity to spill out on each other. Now, Brene Brown and others talk about the power of vulnerability, and I think that is an important portal to our humanity, right? You cannot cultivate a transformative relationship without vulnerability. But structural vulnerability complicates that. It means that I'm also vulnerable to the wounds of white supremacy, right? And so for me as a Black man, I have to understand that I'm structurally vulnerable to that may further harm me if I'm not cognizant Like if I just say I got to be emotional, put it all out there, and that can actually be harmful because of my structural vulnerability. And so in the book, I talk about sort of balancing and thinking about creating safety in ways that allow us to be authentically vulnerable with each other in ways that are nurturing and not exploitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of use the blues in one of the chapters to talk about that, because to me that's a rawness of our vulnerability as a cisgender Black male, that rawness, right, that the blues provided me as a child, and listening to it from my uncles, was a portal for me to understand and tap into things that were messy but real, right? And I just think we need more of those sanctuary spaces in our movements. We need more permission to cultivate transformative relationships. I think we need more opportunities to build them that may not even feel like movement building. But without them, what we end up with is strategic strategy, tactical, mechanistic ways of thinking about community social change. And no movement has ever survived or been transformative with that. This is why the civil rights movement, SCLC, as well as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had a spiritual basis. Now, it was a spiritual Christian basis, but more than that, I think it was the capacity for people to be humane and human with one another in really difficult situations.
Yeah. And I want to like build on what you're saying, because part of us being able to cultivate that is really rooted in what you talk about in the book, when you talk about care. And you make a distinction between us thinking about care at an individual level, us thinking about care interpersonal care, and then institutional care. So as educational leaders, what do we need to know about the distinctions between individual care, interpersonal care, and institutional care?
Well, there's this, the term self-care. I think self-care is important. It has a role, right? But it also has this sort of connotation that in order to be well, I need to take care of myself. And what that does is it lets off the hook the institution, the organization, the society that we are in. And that care should not only be when you have the time to do it, or it shouldn't only rely on the individual. Our institutions have the responsibility that it is our right. This is not some extra shit, right? It is our right to be well. That's not it's a right. And so if our institutions are not thinking about the right, that it is absolute justice to provide the well-being of its workforce and the students, if they're not thinking about that, then what we have is policies that reflect that. Like, only time you can get well is when you get sick. You get sick days. You don't get wellness days, right? And so I just want folks to sort of think differently about, this self-care, interpersonal care, and institutional care, that there's a continuum that we have to always be sort of navigating, and not only believing that my care and my well-being is only a function of my choice, but that choice should be connected to the opportunity that the institution or system of organization in which we live, work, and play.
I love how you make that distinction, because it also is a call to leaders to really think about policies from a lens of care, right? And to be intentional about what that can look like. So thank you for that. So important. The third pivot is about vision, right? And you
Vision.
are really, you calling us in and saying like, yes, like one of the quotes in the book, you say, the fact is that we all need to be in the business of solving problems. There would be no human progress without our collective social problem solving. But right? We often see problems more clearly than we can imagine solutions to them. And it's often easier for us to name, identify, discuss, and articulate the hell out of problems than it is for us to imagine entirely new solutions. So, can you talk more about like what is at the root of our problem loving and what would a pivot toward possibility creating look like?
That term problem loving came from her book, Future Good, amazing book, where she taught me about the term problem loving, and I sort of flipped it to the context of justice. But you know, when you're in pain and suffering, it's easy. It's so not only easy, it is required that we look at the problem, right? Like if you imagine, listen, everybody that's listening to this, imagine you have a thorn in your shoe or a rock and you're walking on it. And then somebody says, hey, you want to go, imagine something else? You're thinking like, hell no, I got this rock in my shoe, right? In other words, pain and suffering is acute and we feel it. And so we focus on it. And that is absolutely necessary. And it's not complete. Yet it's not complete. And our work for justice sometimes engages in the slippery slope of whack-a-mole problem solving, right? And there are so many problems that we need to pay attention to. It's just that we haven't created that space or given ourselves permission enough to create that space of dreaming beyond oppression. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is oppression in many ways suggests that our work is to always be in relationship to oppression and suffering, that our job is to always, oppression predefines what we can do. It predefines it. And what it predefines is you're always in relationship to me as oppression. And it's in our language, right? I talk a little bit about the word anti, right? And the process of defining our world by the absence of things we don't want, right? Again, necessary, Farima. And a more complete part of our journey is to lean into and saturate our lives and our communities and circles with imagining other possibilities. These systems weren't just created, they were imagined first, right? And if we're only thinking about fixing the systems that exist, we will always be fixing the systems that exist. The new conversation about reimagining public safety is the most important conversation we should be having. Why? Because we are actually reimagining public safety. We are saying that there has to be other ways to assure that a community, a neighborhood can stay safe by humane practices. And we don't have the freaking answer to that. I want to cuss, but we don't have the answers to that, but we're damn sure going to try something else. We're going to reimagine it. We're going to engage. And I think that is such an important process that is not only coupled to problem solving. Does that make sense? Am I making any sense here?
Absolutely. And what I want to lift up in what you're saying is that, because it makes me think so much about abolition, right? When we're thinking about reimagining public safety, we're really talking about how do we keep us safe without having to rely on oppressive systems that were created before by the imaginations of white supremacy, right?
Yes.
But I want to lift up also the dangers of leaders who come up with solutions in the absence of the communities that are most impacted by these conditions. So what advice do you have for leaders who are thinking, yes, I'm ready to come up with some solutions to these issues?
This is such a good question. I mean, I don't know how much time we have here, but
we got time.
So we were working in, I was asked to come into a community. I don't want to name the community, but it was a community in the Midwest. It was a Black community in the Midwest 15 organizations, maybe it's 12 organizations that were all traumatized from different reasons, like just trauma. And amongst these organizations could not be in the same room together. It was fights and it was tough, man.
Been there.
Okay, come on, Fadi. Come on. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about. And so the leaders, even the leaders, there's not just the folks that are working on the front line, these are leaders and executive directors had beef and being in that room. So what is your responsibility? Okay, the responsibility is we have to rupture the toxicity. We have to rupture it by using different tools. And so what I found is that the following things happen when you're wounded and you find yourself in the loop of problem loving. Here are some phrases that come up. We can't do that. I don't trust you. You got the money and I didn't. That shit can never happen. Why we can never do so it creates this sort of mindset that eliminates or cripples any part of possibilities, right? So we had to do some deep work on first on the wounds. And those wounds came from distrust in the community. We had hard conversations where people were crying and snotting on each other and pissed off, but we went through it. And by going through that healing process, they're in a different place. They still disagree, but they still respect each other. Does this make sense?
Yep.
And now they're able to create something different because they're in this in a different way. So I think I don't know if I'm answering your question. Am I answering your question?
You are, because what I'm thinking about because when I read that part of the book too, it made me think about like when harm happens in organizations or different collectives, right? And sometimes as leaders, our inclination is like, let's just sweep it under the rug or let's not deal with it. And what happens is that's where the distrust starts to grow and gets worse, right? And so it's justified, right? But there's something else that happens when we're able to sit with the harm and sit with what is necessary for repair. Because once we're able to sit with the problem and really be honest about it, then we're able to see solutions that we can build from those ruptures, right?
Yeah.
And that's huge. That's huge, I think, especially in these times. In order for
it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage and skill to lean into that kind of. I know a number of organizations that that really are struggling right now with existential problems, not just the technical, but like, should I still be a teacher? I'm tired of being a principal right now.
Talk about
I can't deal with it. My health is on the line. Okay. So those old tools, they're not going to work with this new kind of a problem. So anyway, I'm just,
I appreciate that so much. And speaking on like education as an example, I want to move to the next pivot, which is about presence, right? And it's about this, shifting from the frenzy, right? Like this addiction to frenzy, and really like moving from this grind culture and hustle to like this idea of flow. So I would love for you to just first define that. And then I got some questions to kind of complicate it a little bit.
Come on. Well, I'm going to say this right off top because I know kind of where you're probably going to go. Because when I wrote this chapter, I was like, Farima gonna get me, Farima gonna get me, and V gonna get me. But I don't know. I'm talking from my truth and my experience. And so this thing is framed by what I call sort of capitalist patriarchal culture, not capitalism nor patriarchy, but the culture and the values that it produces. And one of the things it produces is this notion that our value is defined by what we can do or earn, right? And so hustle is not the kind of hustle that my daddy did, right? My dad hustled because he got 2 jobs. He had to, my mom hustled. She had to, hustle to make sure she could stretch the, hamburger helper for 3 days. That was a different hustle, right? What I'm talking about is frenzy.
Mm.
And the frenzy is this feeling that you're trying to go north and south at the same time. And you're going nowhere, but you're moving fast as hell. It's this frenzy is this feeling of overwhelming things to do for no reason, right?
Mm.
And sometimes we are guilty of filling our lives with things, and that we become gratified almost for being overwhelmed.
Mm.
Because we I'm so busy, I'm so busy, I'm so busy. I got to do this, I got to do that. I know I'm preaching to the choir over here, so I don't know who, but when we step back and look at our lives, this notion I've got to be a soldier for justice, right? Important body of work. And what does that mean? Does it mean that we don't give ourselves permission to have flow?
Mm.
And so this chapter was significant and important to me to write, simply because it's personal. I've lost 3 dear friends to frenzy because me personally, nor my community gave my colleague and dear friends, permission to rest.
Mm.
That we rewarded them for frenzy. Oh, he a soldier. Well, look at him. Oh, he tired, but he's still gonna go pick up the kids, right? He a soldier. It was kind of like a badge of honor. And I'm not so sure that that's what we should be doing, Farima.
I really appreciated when you complicated it even more when you talk about rest inequality, right? Because you make a distinction between folks who quite literally, are caught in a system that does not give them the same ability to rest as others. It makes me think about, Trisha Hersey in the Nat Ministry and other really important Black women who have been like telling us, right? Can you talk about this idea of rest inequality and why that matters for also like educational leaders? Because it makes me think about also, me and you did a PD with some administrators from a particular school district. And I remember in that moment, there were admin that were giving the message like, yes, teachers, self-care, y'all need to rest and all this other stuff. And the teachers were like, well, shit, can we get some time off? Well, can you give us like the opportunities to actually have that rest, right? But I want to go even deeper with how you talk about rest inequality with particular kinds of access to
Yeah.
rest.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, I remember that. No, I mean, like, we are at a war with rest in our culture. So I'll talk about this on 2 levels. We are at a war with rest in our culture. Not all cultures have a view of rest is, laziness, or rest is wasteful, right? Not all cultures have that, right? And so that, I talk about sort of Starbucks culture or coffee culture, right? That, coffee cultures in this country is like, oh, I can get more done when I have more caffeine. I'm more efficient. I can think and all these other things, right? But rest inequality is, this body of work that says that if rest is really important for our well-being, some people have greater frequency of rest, higher quality of rest, greater duration of rest, and greater frequency of leisure. And it's not, so rest is not just sleep. Rest is the ability to not work and not feel guilty for it.
Mm.
Rest is the ability to not work and rejuvenate.
Mm.
Now, this is not only an individual choice. It's not like I need rest, so it is also a function of structural, racial, and economic inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of these 2 things together, 1, rest is for the weak. 2, that's structured in our society, we haven't even grappled with the significance of rest. and why it's so deeply important in our work for movements. So imagine us. I remember Farima, we worked with a group of about 40 Black teachers about 10 years ago, and we took them up on this retreat, and we told them this is going to be a different retreat, and they thought they were going to get healing curriculum, and we did some of that. But what we did a lot of one day we took Lego logs and we threw them out on the floor, and we said, okay, we're just going to play today, right? And then after lunch, we're going to take a nap. Then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about it. Why? Because people need ruptured space from frenzy. People sometimes need to get pulled out of frenzy so that they can look at their lives. It's hard to even realize when you're in frenzy. And that's the dangerous part.
Mm-hmm. You gave this hella funny, but also I'm sure at the time was not funny example of when you were caught up in the frenzy and poor little Takai got locked in the car, right? You was trying to make this meeting and, and so what happens to our bodies when we are not stopping and pausing and processing what's happening in the moment, how easy we can make life-changing decisions and
not even aware that I was in frenzy, right? Nedra didn't know about that until a couple years later, so she still ain't forgave me for locking my baby in the car. But he all right.
Y'all got to read the book to really, because I was laughing. But I really appreciate when you talk about martyr culture. Oh, yeah. God, that really was like it right there. So I would love for you to talk about when you're thinking about shifting from this like addiction to frenzy toward this flow. Can you explain, like you say in the book, creating and sustaining social justice movements require intense dedication and commitment that often leads to burnout, which in turn fosters a loss of purpose, right? Can you talk a little bit about the dangers of martyr culture and how that feeds into the frenzy?
Yeah, I mean, martyr culture, in some ways, martyr culture is very colonial. In the sense that my entire being and purpose is not, someone said it like this. My job, my friend Jen John said this. My job is not to free the world, but it is to find freedom in it. Now, listen to that. My job is not to free the world, but to find freedom in it. And what she was saying is that what happens is that martyr culture, we reward ourselves for engaging in behavior, practices, ways of thinking that is not sustainable for ourselves, our family, and sometimes our entire communities. Even soldiers at war have to retreat, have to rest, and have to heal their wounds before they enter back into it. So martyr culture doesn't give space for that. What are the consequences of that? Well, not just burnout. I mean, that's easy, but death. We may not have you around. Loss of meaning and purpose, meaning now instead of working to improve the children, the quality of life for children in the neighborhood, you may want to go work, do some other kind of work because you've just been so burnt out, right? I mean, I have a number of students that, man, I mean, I had a student that lived in Baby Hunters Point, and for years and years and years, all these problems were happening to her family. Her brother was shot. She lost her husband. She worked in community organizations. She almost lost her son. I mean, she was going through it, right? And she was like, I'm in it. This is my life, right? And she realized that she needed a break, but she was worried about what people would say if she moved to Hayward, if she moved to Castro Valley. That was her biggest thing. She did move to Castro Valley, right? She moved from where she had grown up. But my work with her was to say, that's okay, because we still need you. And so this notion of flow, Farima, this pivot is a pivot of our awareness, of our consciousness of how present we are with ourselves, with our families and our communities.
Mm-hmm.
We live oftentimes in two directions. We live in the past and we live in the future. Let me say that again. We live in the past. Here's what happened. Here's what they said. Here's what she did. Here's what happened in our society. Here's what they did to Black folks. Here's what they did to Native Americans. We live in the, which is important. We cannot ignore the past. Or we live in the future. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's the things that I got to accomplish. Here's the thing I got to build. Here's the degree I got to get finished. Here's the whatever. But we miss the presence, right? We miss the present.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm suggesting is that flow comes from our ability to sit in the presence, and that there's a gift that we have for our human consciousness, is that when we're in flow, things actually move in our lives through us. That there becomes a way that things happen effortlessly. That there's a lack of resistance, right? That is what flow is, right? And even the term we use in movement is resistance. We know resistance actually is not sustainable. That flow actually is much more powerful than resistance. And so what I'm suggesting is not that we don't have resistance, but I'm suggesting that we actually also have flow, right? And you might be asking, well, what does flow look like? Well, flow might look like finding space for you to find joy regularly. Flow might look like you being able to have time for rest and not feel guilty about it. Flow might look like, having a conversation with someone that you haven't spoken to in a long time. Whatever flow is, it should not be a way that we engage in work that continues to reinforce or exacerbate our habits of not being well.
It makes me think about too how oftentimes I think folks that get caught up in frenzy, it's usually a trauma response, right? It's like overworking, micromanaging, like you get caught up in that. But then I think about like when we rest, like how productive it actually is, like what happens to our bodies when we are resting, like there are things happening. It's not like everything turns off, right? And so actually there's danger in not allowing yourself to have that flow, because if you're always activated, like you said earlier, what happens to our bodies, to our minds, to our spirits? And I can't help but feel like that's why we got such a huge turnover rate when it comes to teaching right now.
Yeah.
Because of that frenzied culture. So I really, really appreciate how you really work this in these ways.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Shawn.
No, I was going to say, it's not just a mechanical shift, but it's also like a cultural shift. Like we have to reward and say, like, if someone says I'm tired, we should, you should take a couple days off, and we should, as if you're in leadership, you should really be thinking about policies that are based in giving people more time. A 4-day work week. We would have never imagined, Farima, never imagined if someone said, you know what, let's work from home for a year, for 18 months. We would have, people have been, are you crazy? We got offices, we're spending money on the offices. You got to be in the office and office. But life happened, the world happened, and guess what? Our reality is now. We have a different way. Some of us who are fortunate can work from home. A lot of people still have to go into a physical place. But my point is that things are possible now that wasn't possible even 3 years ago.
But it also makes me think how like even some folks with that shift will still create a frenzy within their own homes, and just recreate that cycle. So I think what you're arguing here is that there is possibility in us being able to create conditions for us to collectively, individually, and institutionally experience flow and rest in a way that doesn't reproduce the same cycle of frenzy. And I just really appreciate that. I think it's so needed, especially right now during a global pandemic where folks are exhausted, they're grieving, they're hurting, right? And so this actually is a matter of life and death. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thanks,
So
Patty.
we have like 9 minutes left. I want to see if folks have any questions that you want to ask about the 4 pivots. I don't see any now in the Q&A. But if you do have one, I want to give you an opportunity to put it either in the ask a question section or in the chat. I'm looking at some of the comments that folks have put already. Thank you, Michelle, for also distinguishing. Michelle says, the way coffee is ritualized in Ethiopian culture centers community and connection. It's not efficient, nor is the coffee served in large containers to be drunk alone. Thank you for I appreciate that, because you talk about that in the book, Shawn. You talk about how, like, in Latin American countries, we got siestas. It's actually part of the way they do things, right?
Yeah.
It's not just like shaming thing, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Okay, so we have one question. Can you say more about frenzy and martyr culture as a trauma response?
Yeah, good question. So, part of the trauma that we still have yet to heal or grapple with is the trauma of our purpose. And what I mean by that is that our histories are so traumatic from our history, the history of our people, that get translated to the history of our communities, that get translated to history of our families, that they get translated to our own trauma. And the sort of martyr culture sometimes becomes a facade to not deal with that. My good friend and brother I love, George Galvez, always says that, sometimes we use our work to hide our wounds, because work is easier than dealing with that shit, right? He says something like that. George, if you're on here, I hope I didn't quote you too badly. But sometimes our work, our work becomes a false process that we say our work is healing, but we haven't really dealt with the fact that I'm angry at my father for leaving me. We haven't dealt with the fact that I'm embarrassed that my mother became addicted to a substance and left me. We haven't dealt with that, but I'm gonna start this other organization and be the leader of the thing. And so part of that navigation is for leadership and for all of us is to understand that connection, that, if you start with the assumption that we all have wounds, we all have traumatic experiences, and we don't have oftentimes the spaces to heal from that. If we start with that assumption, then that gives us permission to explore ways that we can begin to reconcile our wounds of the past and how it shows up in our decisions and behavior in the future.
Ooh, that idea of like how you talked about in the book, like we run away from our ruptured relationships by overworking, right? And we get caught up in that as a way to not have to deal with that work. It's like so real. And I also think about, oftentimes, especially when it comes to like imposter syndrome or not really, worthy, how sometimes we overcompensate as a way to feel more worthy, right? There's another question, and this question is gonna be a challenging one, Shawn, so get ready.
On.
All right, so the next question is, how do we consider tensions when patriarchy affects rest as resistance? When men decide to rest, which means that then women, and often women of color, end up having to do all the work that they aren't doing because they're resting. Woo!
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. That's a great question. And, part of, I think part of patriarchy, gives permission for rest for men, right? It sort of opens the space and the permission for rest. And I think that we have to lean into that. We have to interrogate that how do we actually democratize rest in our families? How do we democratize rest in our communities? And again, rest is not sleep, but it's also leisure. Let me give you a really personal example, y'all. Y'all want me to get personal? I'll tell you.
I love the example you wrote in the book.
So that question is something that I've dealt with in my own family, right? My own wife. Shawn, you go swim, you jog, you do all this other stuff while I got to get the kids' lunch ready, right? So the first is, okay, that's a blind spot. Let's talk about that. Let's fix that, right? Second, how do we actually create intentional rest for you and everyone else? Like, let's be really intentional about it. I'm not going to resist it. It's an obstruction spot because of my own patriarchy. Let's talk, okay? So now that I see it, I got to make different decisions about how do we actually guarantee and open up space for your own rest and leisure. One of the things that I have learned from my own relationship with my daughter and my spouse is that my spouse wasn't giving herself permission to rest either. So despite the fact that I create the space, she has the list in her head of all the shit that need to be done. And if it don't get done, it's a problem. So we had to be overly intentional. So what I did is we sat down and I said, well, what are the things that bring you joy, that get you happy, that makes you, and I know some of the things. And she said, you know what? I used to roller skate, So I bought her roller skates.
Yes. She be roller skating in the house sometimes, and I love it.
You seen it. You seen it, Fadi, right? I'm not making this up, y'all. Family, I ain't making this up. So the response to that question is we have to be deeply intentional. We have to overcompensate for our claim or right to leisure and rest. It's not going to happen. So the consciousness about how my patriarchy may mitigate and silence your capacity to rest, I have to grapple with that. And we together have to overcompensate to create those spaces of rupture so that it's possible for our families and for our community. So let me give you another example. Me and my spouse have this conversation all the time. I might get rest and she might get rest. But she knows the parents of the young people that she's working with don't get rest. Their jobs, they're working 2 jobs. They're working 3 jobs. So you know what my spouse did? I'm telling y'all the truth. I'm going to tell you what she did. She's an amazing woman.
Is everything.
She said the community don't get no rest. She found and made a relationship with the most elaborate, gorgeous retreat in Northern California. It's called 1440. I'll tell you, I don't care.
Yeah.
It is gorgeous. You know what she did? She said, we want to create spaces for parents to come up here and rest and enjoy the beauty of these redwood forests. She met with these rich folks and she worked with them and she created opportunities, not just for me, not just for her, but for the community to also enjoy rest and leisure. Farima, you know what I'm talking about, right?
And that space is so beautiful. And I'm so glad that you lifted up that example, because Nedra is always the first person to say, you know what, this agenda is too packed. We need to build in some rest, some play, some joy, right? And so there's something really beautiful about what you're talking about, democratizing rest.
Yeah.
It's so, so, so powerful to really think about redistributing access to rest in really intentional ways organizationally. You just gave a perfect example of how an organization can be really intentional about thinking about these things. So thank you for that.
Good question.
I know, right? So good. We are at time though, Shawn, and I want to see, are there any last thoughts that you want to leave people with today before we end?
Just all I want to say is, the thing that we can count on most in the future is more uncertainty. That we're not going to ever get back to what was normal, and that there's a new frontier that's coming ahead of us. We know just today, we see what's going on with Russia today, and that's going to have reverberating impacts for us and our work in this country.
Yeah.
And so we need the tools to be able to hold each other, support each other, and to create a vision of what we really want. And so I hope these pivots really provoke some thoughtfulness on having new conversations about deep change that we need in our society. And I just really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, Fadi.
Always. I do too. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation and seeing how other folks are taking up this book. So if you do decide you want to maybe tweet or share on different social media platforms any pieces from the book that you want to lift up, make sure you use the hashtag 4pivots. Are there any other hashtags, Shawn, for the book right now?
The 4 pivots. I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. I don't.
I'm excited to see how folks are taking up the book, because I do know you give some examples there that are really provocative that I even was like, right. And so I'm just like excited to see how folks really take up what you're calling us in to really think about and do. So
yeah, I just want to challenge everyone to a 30-day pivot. Once you get the book, read it and just tweet your pivot and what you're doing, how it's working, what's difficult about it. Tweet something or put it on, Instagram, but we want to hear that. Use your hashtag to hear about the pivot that you're leaning into.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much, Shawn. As always, it's always like a blessing to be in conversation. And blessings, y'all. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to now pass it over to ER, and he's going to leave us with some more information. I think you're on mute, ER. Okay.
Sorry, y'all. Thank you both for this wonderful conversation. I want to encourage folks wherever you are to click this teal button to buy a copy of the 4 Pivots, Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves from Charis. It really does help us when you purchase the event books from us. We encourage you to buy a copy for your library, for a college library, a public library. Get it out into the community. And of course, consider buying several for organizations in your community, for activists, folks that maybe don't are too busy on the grounds and don't have the time to look up and go to a bookstore. This is the perfect gift. So please consider that. Thank you to our friends at the Auburn Avenue Research Library for always providing incredible resources in the chat. I will be putting this up on our YouTube channel as well. So if there are folks who missed this tonight and they want to reference it, they can watch it at this URL, but they also will be able to watch it at the Charis Circle YouTube in just a couple of days. So thank you both. I hope you stay safe and well. This was truly a gift. And until next time, take care.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care, everybody.